The recording is time-stamped 2:13 a.m. The image is grainy, rendered in a ghostly monochrome of infrared. A full moon, stark and overexposed, hangs in the sky, casting the dense woods surrounding Maren Lake in shades of silver and ash. The security camera, mounted on a pole at the entrance to the Forest Shore campground, is meant to deter theft, to record the license plates of late-night arrivals. It was not installed to bear witness to the impossible. But it does. At the edge of the frame, where the gravel road gives way to the dark, still water, a figure stands. It is tall, unnaturally so, with proportions that seem just slightly wrong. Its posture is stooped, as if bearing an immense weight, and its form is pure, featureless black, a void against the moonlit landscape. It doesn't move. It doesn't breathe. For 47 agonizingly long seconds, it simply exists, a silent sentinel at the water's edge. Then, in the space between one frame and the next, it is gone. 2 hours later, a routine patrol by the night guard would uncover the truth of that empty space. A tent, zipped shut against the cold. A sleeping bag, unrolled but empty. A smartphone and a pair of hiking boots placed neatly beside it. But of the tent's occupant, Clara Mason, a 22-year-old artist and traveler from Portland, there was no sign. She had vanished, swallowed by the silence of the night. This was last October. It was the 7th time in 30 years that someone had disappeared from the shores of Maren Lake without a trace. For Alice Gray, the news was a catalyst. The story, picked up by a few regional news outlets before fading into obscurity, ignited a memory she had long tried to suppress. Alice was an investigative journalist, a seeker of truths buried under layers of lies and time. But her obsession with Maren Lake was older than her career. It was born from the stories of her grandfather, a man with eyes as clear as the mountain sky and a voice that held the cadence of the forest. He was the only one who had ever spoken openly of the figure from the water, a specter he claimed to have seen twice in his youth. The townsfolk had called him a storyteller, a gentle eccentric. Alice had called him her hero. Now, he was gone, and his stories were all that remained. Clara Mason's disappearance felt like a personal summons. The drive north into the mountains of Washington was a journey back in time. The highways narrowed, the cell's signal died, and the air grew sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. She arrived in Redhill, the closest town to the lake, as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. It was a town that time seemed to have forgotten, its main street lined with brick buildings whose facades were slowly succumbing to moss and memory. She checked into the Whispering Pines Motel, a relic of a bygone era, and was given a key to a room with a rattling air conditioner and a window that looked out onto the dark, imposing wall of the forest. That first evening, she went to the only bar in town, a place called the Rusty Hook. It was there, over a glass of flat beer, that she found Joaquin Mora. He was a man carved from the wilderness itself, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his hands gnarled and strong. He was a former forest ranger, retired for over a decade but still possessing the quiet, watchful eyes of a man who understands the woods. When Alice mentioned her purpose, his face hardened. He agreed to help, but his conditions were absolute, delivered in a low, serious tone that brooked no argument. You don't go near that water after sundown. Not for any reason. And when the moon is full, he said, leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers, you do not look into the lake. You understand? The lake, it has a gaze of its own. When the moon is full, it doesn't just reflect. It sees. And it doesn't like to be seen back. Alice, a creature of logic and evidence, felt a prickle of unease at Joaquin's words but filed them away under local folklore. Her first official stop the next morning was the Redhill Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Thompson was a man who looked as worn down as the town he served. He regarded Alice with an air of profound weariness, as if she were just the latest in a long line of thrill-seekers and ghouls drawn to the town's tragedy. Clara Mason, he sighed, pulling a remarkably thin file from a cabinet. We did everything by the book. Search parties, canine units, divers. We spent 2 weeks combing every inch of that shoreline and the woods around it. The divers found nothing. Alice pressed. The divers found nothing because that lake is a monster, Thompson said, rubbing his tired eyes. It's a glacial lake. Deeper than you can imagine in spots, with underwater caves and currents that could pull a truck down. The official cause of death is accidental drowning with the body unrecovered. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And the other 6 disappearances over the last 30 years? Thompson's jaw tightened. Accidents. Unfortunate, but that's all. This is a wild place, Ms. Gray. It has teeth. People fall, they get lost, they underestimate the elements. Or, he added, his voice dropping, they come here to disappear on purpose. Maren Lake is just a place that's very good at keeping secrets. His tone was dismissive, a clear signal that the conversation was over. Frustrated, Alice turned to the town's history. The Redhill Public Library housed the town archives in its damp, musty basement. The archivist, a stern woman named Elara Vance, seemed to guard the records as if they were her personal property. She was reluctant to help, her suspicion of outsiders a palpable force in the small, cramped room. But Alice was persistent, her politeness a relentless tool. After 2 hours of strained silence, Elara finally relented, pointing her towards a stack of brittle, leather-bound ledgers. Alice spent the rest of the day immersed in the scent of dust and decaying paper. She found them, one by one. Not just the 7 in the last 30 years, but more. A young couple in 1946. A logger in 1911. And the earliest official record she could find, a fur trapper, new to the territory, vanished in 1871. The details were always the same. They were outsiders. They disappeared during a full moon. Their belongings were untouched. Their bodies were never found. It was a pattern so consistent, so chillingly precise, that it defied coincidence. As the library was closing, Elara, perhaps sensing Alice's genuine, non-sensationalist interest, silently placed a small, cloth-bound book on her table. From the old museum collection, she mumbled. Before it shut down. It was the personal journal of a forest surveyor named Thomas Pike, dated 1894. Most of it was mundane, notes on topography, sketches of trees. But one entry, from a cold October night, was different. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. October 14th. The full moon rises. There is a sound from the lake tonight. Not a sound of water or wind. It rings. It is not loud, but a deep, resonant tone, as if a great bell were struck in the abyss. It is a sound you feel in your bones. After the ringing comes a silence so total it feels sacred, and terrifying. And in that silence, something moves upon the water. I saw it from the ridge. A shape of pure darkness. It is not of this world. The surveyor's words, the lake rings, became an obsession. It was too specific, too visceral, to be mere fancy. It felt like a key. That night, sleep offered Alice no respite. She dreamt of a vast, dark bell tolling silently beneath black water. She awoke with a start, the phantom vibration still humming in her chest. She knew she had to talk to Joaquin again. She found him at his small, isolated cabin on the edge of the national forest. He was splitting firewood with a practiced, rhythmic grace. When she showed him the passage from the journal, his movements ceased. He stared at the transcribed words, his face a mask of old pain. "My brother, Daniel," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He heard it too. This time, Joaquin led her inside his cabin. The interior was sparse, clean, and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. On a small table in the corner sat a single, framed photograph of a smiling young man with Joaquin's eyes but a softer, dreamier expression. "That's him," Joaquin said. He walked over to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed and lifted the heavy lid. The air filled with the scent of old paper and cedar. I haven't opened this since he left. 15 years ago. Inside were Daniel's belongings. Canvases, brushes, and a stack of sketchbooks. With a trembling hand, Joaquin passed one to Alice. The first few pages were filled with beautiful, detailed landscapes of Maren Lake and the surrounding mountains. But as she flipped further, the drawings changed. They grew more abstract, more frantic. The landscapes were now just backdrops for a recurring shape, a tall, stooped figure, rendered in thick, angry charcoal strokes. In the margins, Daniel had written notes. It has no face. The water doesn't move. It watches me. He was an artist, Joaquin said, his voice thick with unshed grief. He saw beauty where others saw only wilderness. But the lake, it got a hold of him. He said it was calling to him, that the ringing was a song only he could hear. I told him he was sick, that he needed help. We fought. It was the last time I ever saw him. Alice continued to leaf through the final sketchbook. The drawings became almost entirely abstract patterns of shadow and light, spirals centered on a dark void. Then, on the very last page, she found something else. It was a crude map of the lake's shoreline, and on the northernmost cove, a spot was marked with an X. Next to it, a single, cryptic note was scribbled in Daniel's hand, the singing stone. It's loudest here. It answers the moon. A new energy coursed through Alice. This was tangible. A location. A name. The singing stone, she said aloud. What is it? Joaquin looked away, towards the window. A place the old ones, the Salish, considered sacred. A large, flat granite rock at the water's edge. Daniel used to spend hours there. He said he felt closest to the lake's heartbeat at that spot. He looked back at Alice, his eyes pleading. Leave it alone, kid. Some things aren't meant to be found. But for Alice, it was too late. The story was no longer just about Clara Mason or a historical mystery. It was now about Daniel, and the ringing sound, and a specific place on a map that promised an answer. Joaquin's warning echoed in her ears, but the journalist in Alice, the part of her that craved answers, was louder. The singing stone was a physical location, something she could test, a variable in an equation of fear and folklore. Before she would allow herself to be pulled deeper into the supernatural abyss, she needed to exhaust every rational explanation. This led her back to her laptop and the geophysicist, Professor Julian Crow. She emailed him again, this time with the new information, the ringing, the specific location of the singing stone. His reply was almost instantaneous, filled with academic excitement. He insisted on a video call. This is fascinating. Crow exclaimed, his face lighting up the screen. A specific focal point for the acoustic anomaly. That aligns with some of our models. He pulled up a complex bathymetric map of the lake. Our data shows the deepest part of the lake is directly off that northern cove. It's possible a unique geological formation on the lakebed, a sort of natural parabolic dish, is focusing energy there. What kind of energy? Alice asked, her pen hovering over her notebook. My primary theory is still infrasound, generated by immense pressure and slow-moving water currents in the deep trenches. Infrasound, sound waves below 20 Hz, can have profound physiological effects on humans. It can cause feelings of dread, paranoia, shivers down the spine, and even visual hallucinations, seeing fleeting shapes in your peripheral vision. A tall, dark figure. Classic infrasound-induced hallucination. It was a perfect, elegant, scientific explanation. It explained the fear, the sightings, the ringing that was felt more than heard. It was a lifeline of logic, and Alice clung to it. So, the legend, the monster. It could all be a cultural interpretation of a recurring natural phenomenon. Precisely. Crow beamed. For centuries, people have been experiencing these unnerving physical sensations in a specific place and, lacking the science to explain it, built a myth around it. The spirit of the lake. Armed with this new theory, Alice felt emboldened. She wasn't chasing a ghost, she was documenting a geological wonder. She rented a professional audio recorder with a low-frequency microphone and, telling Joaquin she was just going for a daytime hike, made her way to the northern cove. The singing stone was easy to find. It was a large, smooth slab of granite, sloping gently into the crystal-clear water. The air here felt different, still and heavy. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water, Alice set up her equipment. She sat on the stone, recorder running, and waited. For hours, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the pines. But as the moon rose, it began. It wasn't a noise that entered her ears. It was a pressure, a deep vibration that started in the soles of her feet and resonated up through her bones into her skull. It was the ringing. It was deeply unsettling, but she focused on the science, on the infrasound theory. Then she looked at the digital display on her recorder. The microphone was picking it up. But the waveform on the screen was not the chaotic, random rumble of a natural geological event. It was structured. It was a repeating pattern of pulses and pauses. It was complex, ordered, and deliberate. It looked, for all the world, like a broadcast. A signal. Alice stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. Professor Crow's comforting theory had just shattered against a terrifying, inexplicable reality. The structured signal changed everything. A geological anomaly was one thing, an organized transmission from the depths of the lake was another entirely. Alice packed up her equipment with trembling hands, the rational foundation of her investigation crumbling into dust. The feeling was no longer one of academic curiosity. It was primal fear. That night, the anonymous emails started. The first was just the cryptic line she'd seen before. But the next night, another arrived. It was a single phrase, in a language she didn't recognize, Salat Ixla. A desperate online search led her to a digital archive of the Salish language. The phrase roughly translated to, Salat is hungry, or more poetically, Salat awakens. This was no longer a wild goose chase. It was a direct communication. Scared but determined, she found the contact information for Dr. Margot Eaton, the anthropologist whose work on local indigenous traditions had been cited in the archives. Dr. Eaton was a kind, elderly woman with a voice that was both soothing and sharp with intellect. When Alice told her about the name, Salat, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You must be careful," Dr. Eaton said, her tone shifting from academic to cautionary. "Salat is not a story for entertainment. It is a profound and dangerous part of the old faith. The name refers to a mirror spirit. It is said to reside in deep, still lakes whose surfaces are so perfect they become a gateway." "A gateway to where?" Alice asked, her voice hushed. "Not to a place, but to a different state of being," Dr. Eaton explained. "The legend says Salat is a collector of echoes. It calls to those who are untethered from the world, travelers, the lonely, those who feel they don't belong. Those with, as the elders would say, shallow roots. It doesn't kill them. The myth is very specific. It absorbs them. It draws their reflection into the water, and the reflection becomes the new reality, while the person becomes the shadow. They are made part of the spirit's eternal, mirrored world." Alice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through her motel window. A freelance journalist who lived out of a suitcase, defined by the stories she chased, with no home to return to. Her grandfather, her only anchor, was gone. She was the definition of shallow roots. "Why?" Alice whispered. "Why does it do this?" "The spirit is lonely," Dr. Eaton said softly. "It seeks company. It seeks faces to wear in its endless reflection. It is not evil, in the human sense. It is an ancient, elemental force with a need. Driven by a terrible new certainty, Alice spent the next day doing something she had put off. She found the contact information for Clara Mason's sister. The conversation was difficult, filled with grief and confusion. But Alice's gentle questions elicited a portrait of the missing woman. Clara had been a wanderer, moving from city to city, never staying anywhere for long. She felt disconnected from the modern world, her sister said, always searching for something more real. The last postcard she'd sent had been from Redhill. On the back of a picture of Maren Lake, she had written, "I think I've finally found a place that sees me." The words hit Alice with the force of a physical blow. A place that sees me. It was a perfect echo of the legend. Clara hadn't been a victim of a random accident. She had been chosen. And Alice knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she was being chosen too. The approach of the next full moon transformed the atmosphere of Redhill. A palpable tension settled over the small town. For Alice, the feeling was more acute. She felt watched. Not by the people, but by the vast, silent landscape that surrounded her. The water in her glass seemed to have an unnatural stillness, its surface a perfect, dark mirror. She was torn between two powerful instincts, the journalist's drive to see the story through to its end, and the basic human impulse to flee. Joaquin saw the conflict in her eyes. "Go home, kid," he pleaded one afternoon, his voice raw with concern. "You found more than anyone else. It's enough. Don't let it take you like it took Daniel." His words were meant to save her, but they had the opposite effect. She couldn't leave. This was no longer a story she was observing, it was happening to her. The night of the full moon arrived, cold and unnervingly clear. Ignoring Joaquin's pleas, Alice drove to the spot where the campground camera had recorded the figure. She set up her camera and audio recorder one last time, a final nod to the life she was leaving behind, and concealed herself. The hours crawled by. At 2:13 a.m., it began. The deep, boneless ringing filled the world. Then, from the lake, the figure of Saulette resolved itself out of the darkness. Alice stared, her heart hammering, and looked at her camera's monitor. As before, the screen showed an empty shoreline. It was real only to her. But this time was different. The ringing sound shifted, and within the deep hum, a new sound surfaced. A voice. A young woman's voice, faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. It was speaking a single phrase, over and over again, a broken, looping echo, "So beautiful, it sees me, so beautiful, it sees me." It was Clara Mason's voice. An echo of her final thoughts, trapped in the signal. Alice, mesmerized by the horror, looked from the figure to the water's surface. And for a fraction of a second, the gateway opened to her. She didn't just see a reflection, she saw through it. She saw Clara. The young artist was standing on the shore of a Maren Lake bathed in perpetual, golden afternoon sunlight. She was painting, a serene smile on her face. It was beautiful. A paradise. But then Alice saw the horror. The sun did not move. A bird, frozen mid-flight, hung in the sky. Clara's arm moved in a perfect, fluid motion, applying a single stroke of red paint to her canvas, and then it reset, moving in the exact same arc, applying the exact same stroke, again and again. Her serene smile never wavered. She was a perfect memory on a loop. A beautiful, eternal prison. This wasn't peace. It was damnation. The vision snapped shut, leaving Alice gasping on the cold shore, her face wet with tears. The figure of Saulette stood before her, its featureless head inclined, its invitation now laid bare. It did not offer peace. It offered an end to change. An end to pain. An end to lonely wandering, at the cost of everything else. Back in her motel room, Alice stared at her reflection. She saw the shallow roots, the transient existence that made her the perfect prey. She packed her research into a large envelope and wrote a short note to Joaquin. But as she placed it on the desk, a wave of profound guilt and a sudden, fierce desire for the messy, painful, real world washed over her. She couldn't do it. She snatched the note back, grabbed her keys, and ran. But Joaquin, consumed by a terrible premonition, had not been idle. Seeing her car gone and knowing what night it was, he'd raced from his cabin. He arrived at the lake just as Alice was stumbling away from the shore, her face pale with terror. "Alice," he yelled, running towards her. Relief flooded her face. "Joaquin. I saw it. I saw what it is. It's a trap." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "We're leaving. Now. We're getting in my truck and we're not stopping until we see the ocean." But as they turned to run, a coldness fell over them. The ringing from the lake intensified, no longer a hum but a demanding, possessive roar. Salat stood at the water's edge, and it seemed larger, its darkness more profound. It had been defied. It was not accustomed to being defied. Alice felt a violent, irresistible pull, as if a hook had been lodged in her soul. She cried out, stumbling backward towards the water. "Joaquin, it's not letting me go." Joaquin stood between her and the lake, a man of flesh and blood against an ancient god. He held on to her, his knuckles white. "I lost my brother to you," he roared at the silent figure, his voice cracking with 15 years of rage and grief. "You will not have her." He was trying to anchor her, but her roots were too shallow. The pull was too strong. Her feet slid on the gravel. She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror and a final, heartbreaking gratitude. "I'm sorry, Joaquin," she whispered. And then she was ripped from his grasp. She didn't fall into the water, she was absorbed by the air in front of it, vanishing like smoke with a final, soft sigh. Joaquin fell to his knees, his howl of despair swallowed by the sudden, absolute silence. He had failed again. He was alone on the shore, the lake now a placid, mocking mirror under the full moon. The rage and grief curdled into something else, a cold, hard resolve. He had lost everything to this lake. His brother. The woman he had tried to save. His own peace. His roots, once deep in the soil of this forest, had been violently torn out. He rose slowly to his feet and stared into the black water, but this time his gaze wasn't one of fear. It was one of challenge. He looked at his own reflection, a broken man haloed by moonlight. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Then, louder, speaking to the figure that still stood there, watching him. "If you collect echoes, then hear this one." He took a deliberate step into the freezing water. "I'm coming for my brother." He took another step, and another, his eyes locked on the dark figure, never looking away. The legend of Maren Lake changed after that night. Travelers and locals who risk a glance at the water during a full moon no longer speak of a single, lonely figure. They speak of two. One is tall and impossibly dark, a void of ancient hunger. The other stands beside it, smaller but unbowed, a silent, grief-stricken sentinel forever guarding the shore. A ranger, they say, eternally searching for a soul he can never reach in a beautiful prison he can never breach. What do you think is hiding in the depths of Maren Lake? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below.